let me introduce the speaker. So Tyler McFadden is a PhD candidate in the Department of Biology at Stanford University, where he studies human impacts on biodiversity. His research focuses on how ecological communities respond to these impacts and seeks to identify practical strategies for conserving biodiversity in human-dominated landscapes. Tyler has a bachelor's in fisheries and wildlife science from Oregon State University and has studied birds in California, Oregon, Chile, Mexico, Honduras, and Costa Rica. Like, wow, all of these are like birding spots that every birder would want in their like bucket list. Tyler is passionate about environmental education at all levels and loves sharing his enthusiasm for the outdoors with his students. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Tyler. Tyler, take it away.
Thanks, Karan. I really appreciate the kind introduction. Yeah, and thanks, Serena, for helping organize this. Thanks to SFBBO for the invitation and all of you for being here. Karan, actually, if you're involved with the ant surveys, I might see you if you're coming out to Jasper Ridge this weekend. We're catching birds. So ask around, ask where the bird crew is, and maybe come by and see some birds with us. So yeah, I'm really excited to be here. I wish we could be doing this in person, but hopefully soon enough. Hopefully we'll be getting there. And I don't want to keep y'all too long, so I'll just go ahead and dive right in. I think probably goes without saying that we probably all here know that humans are having a massive impact on the planet. We often see a lot of news about climate change, more so than other environmental impacts, but really humans are fundamentally reshaping the planet, both due to climate change, agriculture, expansion of cities, harvesting of wild populations. And in general, us conservation biologists, we've done a pretty good job thinking about what we've already lost. We've documented a lot of extinctions. In fact, many biologists, including myself, would argue we are in the 6th massive extinction event in Earth's history. This one being unique because it's the only one caused by a single species, us. And in particular with birds, I think we've seen about 180 extinct species since in the last 500 years. So we've gotten pretty good at documenting these kind of large charismatic extinction events. We've also gotten pretty good at understanding the declines and the causes of the declines of these charismatic large species. These kind of rare animals that are on all of our buckets lists, the California condor and the gray wolf. So although we don't necessarily have the political will to always do something about it or actually invest the funds in addressing these declines, we're pretty good at understanding, these rare emblematic species and how they're doing. But we tend to ignore the common species. Which I think is actually quite a shame. So about 50% or more than 50% of the human population now lives within an urbanized environment. So really for most of us, 95% of our interactions with wild animals are going to be with these common species like the dark-eyed junco. So you could imagine that if these are the species we're interacting with on a daily basis, these are probably the ones that are actually bringing humans the most benefits and contributing most to human well-being. And if they're common, they're probably also contributing most to the functioning of the ecosystems that we depend on. So I hope by the end of today's talk, you're going to start to kind of flip over to the dark side with me and start to care a little bit more about these common species. And just to drive this point home a little bit more, I want you to take a moment and close your eyes if you need to. Imagine back, think back to when you were a kid. When was the first time that you really noticed a wild animal, that you really saw, wow, there's this other thing out there that exists, that it's not like me, and felt wonder at noticing this? I think back to where you might have seen this, what that animal was. For me, one of the ones that stands out is the woolly bear caterpillar. I don't know if any of y'all have seen these. They're adorable. And this is a picture of me a long time ago. And my family had a small hazelnut orchard up in Oregon. And I used to spend hours looking through the grass and the leaf litter for these woolly bear caterpillars. And we would take them home, put them in a little cardboard box, try to keep them as pets, very unsuccessfully. But if you asked me today, this animal that had, probably a pretty large impact on my life, maybe influenced in some way my trajectory to becoming a conservation biologist. But now as a conservation biologist, if you ask me, how are woolly caterpillars doing? What's their conservation status? I have no idea. We simply don't know for the vast majority, even of our common species, how they're doing, because we've taken them for granted for so long. So I want you, once you have that animal in mind, I want you to ask yourself, how is it doing? Do you have any idea what its conservation status is? Is its population declining? Is it increasing? And why might that matter? Both to you personally and broader to society and to ecosystems. And so with that in mind, I'd like to give you just a brief outline of where we're headed today. So first, I'd like to kind of set the stage a little bit, thinking about urban nature and the importance of common species to ecosystems and to people. And then we're going to start to think about birds as indicators of ecological change. And we're going to look at long-term population trends of birds at a local nature reserve, that's Jasper Ridge. And then we're going to dive a little bit deeper and think about how is climate change and specifically drought affecting birds in the Bay Area. And lastly, I'd like to discuss a little bit a project that we're proposing, trying to get off the ground, looking at bridging the nature gap. So how do we ensure that future generations and current generations in the Bay Area have equitable access to high quality nature and to birds in the future. So let's get started. Unfortunately, we are starting to learn a little bit more about these common species, and we're finding that even these common widespread species, which supposedly should do well around people, are actually declining more than we might think. So this was a landmark study that came out 2 years ago. Probably a lot of you saw this, showing that since 1970, the US and Canada have lost approximately 3 billion bird individuals. So that's 1 in 4 birds have disappeared in the last 50 years. And these numbers are disproportionately made up of common species, actually. In many cases, the rare species are doing fairly well. And in North America, we've started to get pretty good at intervening and learning how to address population declines. But actually, that dark-eyed junco I showed you a picture of earlier is one of the species that's experienced the greatest declines in numbers across North America. And this really is a problem because little nature and these common species actually have big benefits. So this is one of my favorite examples of the benefits of nature to human health. And it's a study conducted a couple of years ago by other folks at Stanford. And what they did is they recruited 2 groups of volunteers, or I guess 1 large group of volunteer, and they randomly assigned them to a group. One of the groups took a 50-minute walk along El Camino Real. So a main artery within Palo Alto. The other group took the same length of walk, but in a small nature area at the Dish. So this is an area just off of Stanford campus. It's not a particularly pristine natural area. It's a city park with a paved trail and lots of people. You can hear traffic noise from there. But even still, just that short walk in nature led to reduced anxiety, improved mood, improved working memory at numeric tasks. So, really a massive benefit from really a tiny exposure to nature. Now, unfortunately, these benefits of nature aren't accessible to everyone. These aren't equally distributed. So, for example, looking again in our area here, we see an aerial map of tree cover in Palo Alto and East Palo Alto. This white line is Highway 101. So you can see a massive disparity in the amount of tree cover, the amount of green space, even within two similarly densely populated cities. And we can extrapolate out and we can actually see that this impacts not only green space and access to green space, it also impacts surface temperatures. And this is tightly correlated to income, very, very strongly related to historical housing discrimination policies, such as redlining. So all of these socioeconomic disparities, racial biases are coming together, reducing the amount of tree cover in many of our poorer urban areas, disproportionately made up of Black and Brown residents. We see lower income in those areas, and we see much higher surface temperatures. So we're seeing unequal exposure to climate change. I'd really highly recommend all of you, now that we have these nice thermometers in our cars and we can see the thermometer as we drive around, next hot day, notice how that thermometer changes as you're driving around through different neighborhoods. I've done it before, and you'll see, easily 5-degree swings when you cross a couple blocks. Now, these impacts go even further, though. As you could imagine, fewer street trees means fewer birds. This is from a really cool study done in Los Angeles, published last year. They went out and they surveyed trees and birds in a whole bunch of neighborhoods across the Los Angeles area, in low, medium, and high income neighborhoods. And as you can clearly see in the photos, and the data supports, we see a lot more street trees as we move from low to high income areas. And unsurprisingly, we see a greater density of migratory birds as we move from low to middle to high income areas. And so we see that these benefits of nature are not equally distributed. And to me, it just really drives home this point that the environment, society, and well-being are truly inseparable. They all depend on each other. And if you're into science, if you're into papers, this is one of the coolest papers that's come out in the last decade, I think, by Chris Schell, recently relocated, I think, to Berkeley. So we'll be hearing more from him, hopefully. But I love this diagram because it highlights how these different factors are all interrelated. So, we have systemic biases, we have social inequalities, racism, immigration, gentrification, all coming together to shape our urban environment. It shapes where buildings are built, where trees are planted or where they're cut down, how urban heat changes. And all of this comes together to influence the ecosystem and the nature available to people in that area. And so we see this really critical feedback between the health of our environment and social justice. And so what I'd really like to see is how can we better leverage birds to build a better Bay Area? We're coming out of this last year, the pandemic, social unrest, some really terrible experiences with racial profiling and discrimination. How can we use birds to start to contribute towards creating a better society here? And so we can think of birds as a good model for this for a few reasons. One, they're fantastic ecological indicator species. They're literally the canary in the coal mine. They're famous for being taken down into coal mines because canaries would sing their heads off, and they would they're very sensitive to air pollution in the coal mines. And so miners would notice if the bird stopped singing because it passed out or died from pollution, they needed to hightail out of it. Birds are also, really valuable culturally. They're a source of recreation, of beauty, of rejuvenation. I don't need to drive that point home. All of you are birders, I would imagine. And they're also incredibly important to our ecosystems. So how can we start to take this knowledge, all of this data we've been collecting for decades in the Bay Area on birds, all of this passion for birds, and use that to contribute towards making a better place, not only for the birds, but for the people who live here. So this brings me now to looking at how birds are doing. So we took a deeper dive into looking at long-term population trends at the Jasper Ridge Biological Preserve. So For those of you who aren't familiar with it, Jasper Ridge is located up in the foothills of the Santa Cruz Mountains, just west of Stanford campus in Palo Alto. It is actually closed to the public in general, kind of to protect the long-term experiments that are there. But if you don't get the chance to visit at some point, I'd highly recommend visiting Windy Hill. It has a very similar environment, similar ecosystem. And Jasper Ridge is also the unceded ancestral home of the Muwekma Ohlone Tribe. And so I think if we're thinking about bird conservation and we're thinking about how do we leverage it for increasing social good, we also have to think about how are we using our work, more broadly to promote social justice and change and a greener Bay Area. Because this is the ancestral home of people who have never ceded their territory. And it is an area that is to this day closed to the public unless you are a Stanford affiliate with an approved research permit. And so I think we need to, and me included as a researcher at this reserve, really think critically about how do we expand access to nature both within Jasper Ridge and beyond its fences. And how do we use this research and our privilege of being there to improve the world, not just to do research for the sake of science. And that said, there are a lot of folks at Jasper Ridge who are doing just that. And so research, this is really a fantastic place for doing research. I think there are something like 60 or 70 or 80 ongoing studies at the preserve right now, including multiple kind of long-term data collection initiatives. It's one of the major goals of the reserve is contributing to broader conservation goals as a piece in this kind of puzzle, this landscape mosaic of protected areas. And increasingly, we're trying to figure out where it's a great place for bringing people to reconnect with nature, to build bonds to both community. And so I think we should think about how we can build on these efforts and continue them. But the question today is how bird populations are changing. And so can we use birds as this indicator of the health of the Bay Area? This is a pretty nice nature reserve embedded in this rapidly urbanizing matrix of Silicon Valley. And so for this section of the talk, I'm going to be drawing on data that was analyzed, and all of this was done by a undergraduate / master's student, Julian Weta, who I've been working with. If you ever get the chance to see one of his talks, they are outstanding. Drop everything to see it. So Julian's been working with this really cool data set where volunteers at Jasper Ridge have been going out every month for the last 30 years. And they've been walking transects within these different colored regions. And so each of these 6 regions gets walked and surveyed every month. And the volunteers record every single bird that they either hear or see. And so this has resulted in a little over 2,000 surveys being completed, almost 190 species identified, almost 500,000 individual birds detected, and almost 200 volunteers who put in the hours to get this done. And so I want to say, first of all, thank you to every single volunteer who has put in the work to make this happen. This is an incredible effort to get 30 years of data collected continuously like this. And so how do we take this data and turn it into a conclusion about how that population is doing? It's a little more complicated than you might think. So let's take the example of the California scrub jay. And I have to say again, I borrowed these slides from this section from Julian because I really loved the way he described the data here. And so we can look at the scrub jay and we can actually plot, for example, how many scrub jays we're seeing per transect over all the different years. And we'd be tempted to maybe draw a slight declining line here. But it also is going to depend on different factors, like who was the observer that day, or what month was it? Maybe scrub jays are more abundant in different times of year. So we need to statistically control for a couple different factors. And so we controlled for things like the survey sector. There were 6 different regions. Clearly, some of them experienced higher abundance of scrub jays. We can control for the day of the year because there's some strong seasonal patterns. And also we control for observer. You know, maybe some observer has a little better hearing or sight than another one. So we statistically control for these things, and then we can model based on that the abundance of scrub jays over the years of the survey. And then we can kind of translate this into a % change in abundance since the start of the surveys. So we see that initially there was a slight increase, but then a steady decline over the 1990s, 2000s, and 2010s. And we've seen on average, our best guess is there was a 50% population decline in the last 30 years of the California scrub jay. So we repeated this process for all of the species that we could. There were 66 species for which we had sufficient data to actually model this out and come up with a interpretable trend. And of these 66 species, 26 experienced some either long-term increase or decrease. So this would be like a statistically significant long-term trend. And so we've plotted out here just the species that had a statistically significant trend. And so the way we can read this is the dot is the mean estimated population trend. So this is the % change in abundance since 1989. So if you're on the right side of this dotted line, it's an increasing trend. If you're on the left side, it's a decreasing trend. And the whiskers here on here, the line, that represents our 95% confidence interval. So we're 95% sure that the true value is within that range. And what really stands out immediately is just the sheer number of species that are declining, even though we're in a strictly protected reserve. 1/3 of species we evaluated are declining at Jasper Ridge. And this is pretty astounding, honestly, for an area that really hasn't undergone any major changes in this time period. And it's a lot to look at by all the different species. So I'm just going to add in a couple key takeaways. 4 of the declining species are either endemic to California or they're near endemics. You know, maybe they cross over a little into Oregon or Baja California. And so those are the California towhee, the Nuttall's woodpecker, California thrasher, and the wren-tit. So these are species found essentially nowhere else on Earth, and they are declining even in a nicely protected preserve. We also see that shrub nesters and ground foragers seem to be disproportionately affected. So species like our state bird, the California quail. Not on this graph. There are also 4 species who had some major population trends, but statistically we couldn't handle it because they either increased from 0 or they decreased to 0. So those are the American crow, the wild turkey, and the house wren have all arrived since 1989, and olive-sided flycatchers have essentially disappeared from the reserve. So we do see a pretty dynamic system. We see some winners, we see some losers, but really my big question when we saw this is what the hell is going on? This is a strictly managed protected reserve, and it has been since the 70s. So really, hopefully we should be seeing population increases, or at least stable populations. So what is going on here? And this brings me to the next part of the talk. So we're going to dive a little deeper into what's the effect of climate change, and in particular drought, on our birds at Jasper Ridge. So as you all know, we are actually in the midst of we are entering a new drought in California. So this is a map I downloaded this morning from the California Drought Monitor. About 3/4 of the state is currently in extreme drought, including all of the Bay Area. And we know that with climate change, we are expecting to see increasingly long and severe droughts and increased frequency of droughts as well. And we've had a few very large droughts and extended droughts in the recent years. 2007 to 2010, 2012 to 2016, and then now the current one which started in 2020. So what is the impact of drought on birds at Jasper Ridge? And so I'm going to actually use a different long-term data set, also collected at Jasper Ridge. And this is, Julian and I have been kind of working in tandem on these. He's been mostly doing the transect data set, and I've been working on this other data set. So we're kind of running these two analyses a little together. And so this data set that I'm going to introduce, they started in 1999, and they've been running it until now. And what they do is, again, volunteer observers go out once a month, and this time they visit 28 different sites, each of these yellow dots. They get to that dot, and they survey birds for 7 minutes. They count every single bird they see or hear within a 40-meter radius circle around them. And again, this is a huge volunteer survey effort. Almost 6,000 surveys have been conducted, almost 40 observers, and we have really good coverage, an average of 10 surveys per point per year. So we see that we're missing very few months. So this is a really nice, high-resolution data set of how the bird community is changing. Let's see. So one of the first things we did when we started to explore, okay, what's going on here, is we started to try to visualize what could be the effect of drought on bird abundance. And so these graphs show in blue the drought. So high values mean lots of moisture available. Low values of blue mean very little moisture. So we see these big dips. These are the major droughts. And we see in red the abundance of these three different species. And so at first glance, it looks like, Bewick's wren seems to be kind of tracking moisture levels pretty well, increasing in wet years, decreasing in dry years. We see something fairly similar with Anna's hummingbirds. But on the other hand, we see with chestnut-backed chickadees, it seems like almost the reverse is occurring here. So obviously not enough to just kind of, eyeball it. So we quantified the effect of drought on bird abundance using very similar statistical models as before. And we used, as an indicator of drought, we used something called the Palmer-Z index. And it's essentially just a measure of monthly moisture availability. So it does take into account both temperature and precipitation. And again, we controlled for things like the survey location, the observer, the habitat type, and seasonality. And we just did this for the 29 most commonly observed species. So these are the species that we have the best, most rigorous data for. And we only did it for the breeding season, just to keep things simple for now. And so I'm going to show a similar plot to before. The way you can read this is that on the left, we're going to see the drought losers in red. On the right, we'll see the winners in blue. And if the bars and dots are gray, that means it was not a significant effect. And so we see that there are 8 species that were our drought losers that are where drought is having a negative effect on their populations. And we see just 2 species that are increasing in response to drought. And we see this pretty well spread across our different species. So they're ordered from most common to least common. We see drought effects occurring throughout. Let me switch over just to pictures of the birds so you can get a better idea of who they are. So our losers on the left, we got a pretty wide swath of different types of birds. We have a Bewick's wren, which is a kind of mid-canopy insectivore. We've got hummingbird, which obviously a nectarivore. We've got a couple endemic or near endemic species down here again, omnivores, granivores. On the losers, though, we do have 2 kind of ecologically similar species, the mourning dove and the quail. They're both primarily ground foraging granivores that eat seeds and some berries, some insects. So we see a couple winners. We see a lot of losers to drought. And we are currently working on diving a little bit deeper into the data here, and we're working on a couple experiments to try to hone in a little better on why different species might be responding differently. And so that brings me back to kind of the next step here. So we see common birds, common species in general, are incredibly important to, especially to urban ecosystems and to people, but to ecosystems in general. We've seen some pretty impressive declining trends of birds, even in a protected area within the Bay Area. We see that drought seems to be playing a big role. And so now I'd like to just focus on a future project that we're trying to get off the ground right now. We're doing some pilot work on it right now, trying to think about how climate change and urbanization interact with each other, actually. And so thinking about what are the climate change threats to birds and to people? How do those threats align with each other? Are birds and people kind of facing similar threats? Can we use birds as indicators to help us understand climate change impacts on people? And importantly, does this level of threat vary with urbanization and socioeconomic disparities? So, we could imagine effects of climate change might be very different in a nice reserve like Jasper Ridge that has plenty of water, plenty of shade, versus a lower income urban area like East Palo Alto, where we see less shade, we don't see water, we see, a lot more vehicles and emissions just because of where the city is sited and high densities of residents. Unfortunately, the funding for this project is still pending. So, if you know anyone with deep pockets, let me know. But the general idea of the project is to sample different neighborhoods along this urbanization gradient. So our reserve site, our least urbanized area is Jasper Ridge, but we'll be running along 9 different neighborhoods going from Jasper Ridge to East Palo Alto. And we will be sampling birds at each of these sites in both spring and summer. So that's going to be kind of our simulation of seasonal drought. So we'll sample them in the wet season in spring, and then again in the late summer after we've had this long period of warm, dry weather. And at each of those sites, during those 2 sampling periods, we're going to be measuring things like bird nutrition and dehydration and disease prevalence. So all of that is from blood samples, as well as just basic body condition of the birds. And then in people, we'll be quantifying access to nature and also recruiting volunteers to do timed walks around their neighborhood. And we'll be measuring stress before and after those walks to see if the nature experiences provided to people living in these different neighborhoods differs both as a result of urbanization and because of climate change, since we have that seasonal comparison. So right now, we're actually this week working on the pilot study at Jasper Ridge. And so here I am working with Julian here, with a former student, Judith, who's in the audience, also pretty cool scientist who's starting her own PhD this year. And then friend and collaborator, Lucas Pavan. Also, this is in collaboration with a good colleague of mine, Juan Navedo in Chile. We've been working together the last 6 or 7 years now, and he's a physiological ecophysiologist. And so we're catching the birds, taking all sorts of measurements, collecting blood so we can measure, nutrition and dehydration. And hopefully we'll get the funding so that we can start to replicate this at those other 8 sites along this gradient. And then lastly, a really key component of this project is community engagement. We don't want to be, just these, ivory tower scientists coming in and telling people how to manage their cities and what they're doing wrong with their birds. That's one, that's ethically pretty questionable, and 2, that's not how conservation works. It's just not very functional. And so we're going to be building off of some pretty strong connections we have with local communities through the local high school. So my wife, Aja, is actually a high school teacher at the high school that serves this entire gradient. That's part of why we picked those particular sites. So We know a lot of students and families who live in all of these different neighborhoods. And we've been working for the last 5 years running this really cool program called the MERO Science Program. We recruit a group of 12 or 13 high school students who are all English language learners. And the point of the program is to really empower underserved students through outdoor recreation, through involvement in ecology. Our goals: community building, long-term mentorship, academic support. We know these students from the time they're freshmen to the time they're going to college. We're often the emergency contacts in their phone books. And so we will be really building on these sorts of connections, recruiting students as our employees, as our ambassadors, as our environmental education ambassadors. And with the goal of supporting not only the students, but also co-creating recommendations for urban conservation. So we'll be working with MERO students as kind of leads on the project and going into additional classrooms to help brainstorm with students from these different neighborhoods. What do you see in your community? What do you like? What do you not like? What do you want to see in the future? So hopefully we can really start to build some recommendations that are acceptable and actually address the issues that people living in these different neighborhoods have and want to see addressed. And so bringing it all together, I'd like to challenge myself and all of you that we can really do more as scientists. We shouldn't be just doing science for the sake of science or just collecting data to store it in a computer and say that we have the data. The outdoors, ecology, birds, these are all really good tools for engaging with complex issues, engaging with society, engaging with students, supporting people as they grow. And second, we really need to protect places like Jasper Ridge, like other reserves. But I think even almost more importantly, we need to expand conservation efforts beyond these protected areas. We can't just, build a fence around an area and call that good enough. Reserves aren't enough on their own. Conservation is really about people, and people live where these common species live. So we need to start caring about them, caring about these common species to actually support people and build a world where everyone has access to nature and can benefit from it. So with that, I'd like to thank all of you. Thank you for being here. Thanks for attending. Thank you to my huge long list of collaborators and friends and supporters and funders. Really, I'm kind of like this crazed acorn woodpecker trying to build a nice granary. You can't do it on your own. It's a cooperative process. And so thank you, everyone. And I'd also like to end with a little plug. I'm defending my PhD in a month on June 7th. So I will try to post the link to the Zoom defense online, on Twitter, try to share it around. So all of my work is actually focused on Chile. So this will be a 2-for-1. It'll be a totally different presentation. And you can come hear about how we tried to follow these little hummingbirds around the woods with transmitters on their back. They're really fast. So thank you so much. Love to take any questions, love to stay and chat with anyone. And please feel free to reach out to me anytime. Here's all my contact info. Love to chat and get to know you all more. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tyler. That was amazing. Really interesting work that you're doing, really important work. And yeah, I hope everybody enjoyed it. I know that I definitely learned a lot. So we'll get started with our Q&A. So the first question I see, so when you were showing the slide that showed kind of the trends for birds that were declining versus those that were, so we had someone ask if the occurrence of sudden oak death in Jasper Ridge has an impact on species that use acorns.
That's a great question. We actually haven't considered that. That's a really good idea of something we should look at. I know it's in the area. I haven't seen, any like massive die-outs or anything within Jasper Ridge. Not to say they haven't happened, and I certainly wasn't around in 1989 at Jasper Ridge. So I'm going to write that down as something to look at. We have looked a little bit with the acorn woodpecker, or Julian has looked at this, I should say. And as you could imagine, acorn woodpeckers do track acorn production pretty well. So there is another data set collected at the reserve with, I think, about 30 years of acorn data, and they follow pretty nicely. I think it mostly has to do with the masting cycles of acorn production. So they have, kind of boom and bust cycles. But it would be really cool to see if that has to do with sudden oak death. Thanks for the question.
Cool. And then Karan asked for future studies. Do you plan to collect a sample of feather from the birds as well as the blood sample?
We are not planning on that at this point. Yeah, definitely be cool for DNA. If you have something in mind that you'd like to do with it, definitely open to collaborating. We're catching these birds. While one kind of principle of any sort of animal capture work is, if you're going to capture a bird, put them through the stress, you want to get as much data as possible out of them.
Yeah, I guess I can add that the lab I used to work at UCLA, they started the Bird Genoscape project. So they actually were getting feather samples from all over, including some from SFBBO, to kind of construct kind of the landscape of what the genes, I guess, genetic populations of different birds. So that's a potential.
Cool. I personally know nothing about genetics and genomes, but I would love to collaborate. So yeah, let me know if you might be interested, or anyone you know is interested. We could definitely take some extra samples.
Nice. And then Chris said that for your MERO program, which is great, she said she heard Karina Newsom, who is a pretty well-known black birder, and I think she's a graduate student as well.
I think she just defended, or is about to. I saw something on Twitter. She has some cool work.
Nice. Yeah. She said that on a podcast that a big barrier to people of color and lower income people going into science, environmental, and outdoor programs is the lack of paid internships or experience gathering work that they need to do. And so Chris wanted to know if you had a take on that.
Yeah, absolutely. That is a huge barrier. And yeah, this is something that we've talked a lot about in our own lab, about how do we try to make these decisions about maximizing our funding and paying all of our field assistants and our interns. It is definitely really challenging these days with poor funding for conservation, but I think this needs to be the top priority in our funding. If we can spend thousands of dollars on lab equipment, we can spend that money on our field assistants. Unfortunately, I haven't always been able to pay students as well as I'd like, but definitely this, I think, needs to be the top priority.
Absolutely. We here at SFBBO definitely feel that too. And so it's something that we're working on as well.
I think, yeah, one of the challenges I've seen is, and I remember, I'm sure you felt that too, Serena, is the getting into the field and feeling this, like, you have to get experience in order to get a job that pays, but you have to get a job to get experience. And it's this really awful cycle. And so definitely, I think any program that can get people out getting paid internships that pay actually a decent wage is really a great thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for sharing that. And then we had another question from Ori. It seems that the species you found are negatively affected by dryness are not necessarily the ones declining overall. Are you exploring other hypotheses for the declines you've observed?
Yeah, that's a great one. I'm glad you were looking and listening closely to pick that up. I think you must be seeing the like the California quail, for example, that's declining but supposedly responding positively to drought. I think a couple things might be happening here. One is that our data sets don't necessarily align. So the data we used for getting the long-term trends extends an extra 10 years into the past. And so I think part of it probably has to do with, picking a different start point. So the 20-year data set we used for looking at drought impacts, I think California quail were probably already at a pretty low point in their population. So maybe they happened to have kind of a blip during some drought years. So definitely something we need to look further into, and we'll be repeating that drought analysis also with this 30-year data set. So that'll help us know, is it just an artifact or is there something going on here?
Yeah, very cool. And then we had a nice comment from Sonia, so I'll share that. Sonia says, thank you for tying systemic racist systems and the impact on ecology and the overall well-being of the ecosystem. So that was really nice. And then Dudley asked, what kinds of impacts do you see on local birds of the ones that are recent arrivals? So the things that you mentioned, like the crows, house wrens, etc.
Yeah, actually, this whole project started out as a side project because of one of those recent arrivals, which was the wild turkey. And so I think this was 2 years ago. Jasper Ridge has camera traps out for getting pictures of mostly mammals, but they started to get a lot of pictures of turkeys. And one day they got a great picture of a cougar carrying a turkey in its mouth. And so my advisor, when next time I saw my advisor, he was telling me all about it and excited, and he's like, oh, you should look at something with the turkeys, because there's only a couple of us ornithologists at Stanford. And so we started to look into some of the data, and then pretty soon it, expanded and became this large side project. And I haven't really gotten around to looking what's the issue with the turkeys. I do think, Dudley, you bring up a good point with especially the crows and the house wrens, though. So we do see, for example, a decline in the California scrub jays. I would not be surprised if that's partially due to competition with the crows that have arrived, since they do have similar diets. Same thing, house wrens could be playing a role in the decline of the Puix wrens, although the declines for Puix wrens haven't been as strong. So great point.
Awesome. Well, I think that is the last question that we have for now. So I do want to thank you again, Tyler, for this great talk. And I want to thank everybody who joined and listened in. Tyler, is there any last things you want to say to everybody before we sign off?
Just thanks for coming. I really appreciate all the good questions and the great turnout. It's really, really fun and cool to see so many people interested in birds, interested in ecosystems and conservation.